it looks like Jedi Survivor is going to be the next game using massive amounts of VRAM. Let me actually pause this real quick and let's take a look at the MSI Afterburner stats here, because I think this shows two things: massive VRAM issues and horrible CPU limitations. And these are the same kinds of issues we saw with The Last of Us, Hogwarts Legacy, especially when using ray tracing. Guys, okay, so I'm just saying, this seems to be quite the trend lately, and I'm really hoping that there's going to be a day one patch that addresses a lot of this, but at this point I don't have my hopes up. This is an Unreal Engine 4 game, similar to Hogwarts Legacy, and let's see, I think Callisto Protocol, when using ray tracing, especially, got really CPU limited. Let me talk about what I'm seeing here, though. First of all, these are MSI Afterburner stats. They might be a little bit hard for you to see, and this is not my footage. I don't have a review sample of the game, but I'm definitely preloading it now. Expect benchmarks of this game at some point after it launches on the channel. But this is from GameStar. All my sources will be in the description here, and I have several written articles we can talk about as well, some screenshots about what's going on here. But this MSI Afterburner stat shows 18 gigabytes of VRAM allocated. Maybe that's not really needed. This is on an RTX 4090, and RTX 4090 has 24 gigabytes, so some games will allocate a lot more than they really need, but I have some written articles here that suggest, no, it really needs a lot. Maybe not 18 gigabytes at 1440p, but it's still using a lot, and this CPU here is a Ryzen 9 5900X, which is a 12-core, 24-thread CPU, and you can see here that the RTX 4090 is delivering about 33 frames per second in this scene, except that 4090 itself could deliver a lot more, but what's going on here is that it's CPU limited. The RTX 4090 is only being used 33%. Meaning you could expect it to actually be capable of closer to 100 FPS in this scene, but the Ryzen 9 5900X is only delivering 33 frames per second, and so the GPU is just waiting. That's what's going on here. Now, you don't see any one thread that's like 100%, but you see about 4 threads that are being heavily used. We see some up in the upper 70s. This is a classic sign of a CPU/RAM bottleneck holding back the GPU. But again, 18 gigabytes of VRAM allocated at 1440p here, and it's CPU limited. Is this the only thing showing this? Well, first of all, this same video shows a lot of other scenes. They're not all up at 18 gigabytes. Some are around 10 gigabytes. We're around 48 FPS here. You can just jump around throughout the video. 18 gigabytes, about 33 FPS. Here we're seeing 18 gigabytes, around 43 FPS. But again, the GPU utilization is never very high. So what I'm seeing in this test system is basically that Ryzen 5000 CPUs are not going to be able to give you 60 FPS experience in this game. And if it's this low at times, then I don't think even a 7800X 3D is going to get you 60 FPS in a scene like this. Especially the scenes delivering like 33 FPS. We didn't double CPU performance in one generation. Now, looking at the PC Gamer Jedi Survivor review, there is a section where they talk about performance. So they're basically saying the game's pretty good, but then the only thing that threatened to ruin my good time were the constant performance issues on the PC version, saying that at times it's plummeting to 15 to 20 FPS during cutscenes. I don't think the author knows, but I think what's actually happening there is it's spilling over the VRAM during the cutscene. He admits to being no Unreal Engine expert, says that the worst slowdowns always seem to occur when the game's loading stuff in the background, which certainly could be it, and that would be a CPU limitation most likely. And it's saying that, for example, this is happening when they use the galaxy map on Cal's ship. It turned into a slideshow every single time, presumably because it begun loading the planet he's about to travel to, so he's speculating on what's going on. Now, this is on a 2080 Super, which would be an 8 gigabyte GPU, on an i9-9900KS. Again, from a similar generation, maybe even a little bit slower than our Ryzen 5000 CPU usually here in gaming, with 32 gigabytes of RAM. Was lucky to squeeze 35 FPS average in the open world, well, semi-open world, whereas isolated levels were more up to 80-90 FPS. So again, without seeing the actual MSI screenshots, Afterburner screenshots from this source, I have to do a little more speculating what's going on here, although they do say that they tried out an RTX 3060 on a Ryzen 7 5700G 16 gigabytes of RAM, had similar problems. Now, the RTX 3060 would at least have 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so this is probably not entirely VRAM issues, although some of them could have been, especially on the 2080 Super at 8 gigabytes. But again, a 5700G, not a super powerful CPU, weaker than what we're seeing here on the 5900X, and this is causing CPU limitations for sure based on what we're seeing on those Afterburner stats. So, looking very, very rough here. This author is saying that there's only FSR2 available, there's no DLSS. He's saying he wished he had DLSS. However, I think he's partially blaming that on the image quality, but also on it usually failed to improve the FPS. Okay, but the reason why FSR2 would fail to improve FPS is, again, an indication of a CPU bottleneck. FSR will increase performance in the same way that DLSS 2, not 3, but DLSS 2 would, by lowering the load on the GPU. But if the GPU is already not fully utilized because you're limited by the CPU, then you will not increase performance when you enable FSR2 or DLSS. So that is what is happening here. At least a lot of his problems are likely a CPU limitation. Again, seeing the same thing in this video. Going over to another site here with PCMRace or PCMRace, PC Master Race. This is Machine Learning Translate. I had Google translate this article because this was not originally in English, but it's one of the most thorough write-ups I've seen on the performance. This is again on a PC with a Ryzen 5000 processor, this one a 5950X, but again, that has 16 cores, 32 threads, but again, more threads aren't going to help based on what I'm seeing on this Afterburner shot here, showing that there's really only about 4 cores that seem to be heavily utilized. Like in this one, we're seeing a 73%, an 80%, a 74%, we had like a 68%, so there's 4 heavily utilized, and then some also being utilized, but about 4. And again, Unreal Engine 4, I think, doesn't usually heavily multi-thread successfully. So this is on a 3080 Ti, and this author is saying that the game barely runs at 30 to 40 FPS at best. The problem, similar to other titles like Hogwarts Legacy, is that 12 gigabytes of VRAM isn't enough for 4K gaming, causing gameplay in certain areas to drop to 20 FPS or below. So these massive drops seem like they can be VRAM related, whereas the typical low frame rate could be more of a CPU related issue. And again, in this PC Gamer article, I think the 15 to 20 FPS dips in cutscenes, while it could have maybe just been loading something in the background, could still be CPU related, I think could also very likely be a VRAM spillover, causing that kind of extremely low stuttering. Anyway, so this author is definitely saying drops to 20 FPS or below caused by lack of VRAM, and this is on the 12 gigabyte RTX 3080 Ti. He's saying, I mean, unplayable. In a specific part, had to lower the resolution to 1440p or lower the details to low or medium because there was no way the game would go above 15 FPS due to a lack of VRAM. So, definitely looks like 4K is going to be absolutely brutal, and 1440p is going to be pretty rough as well. So they also tested with a Core i7-12700 running an RTX 3070. They're mentioning the system requirements, suggesting RTX 2070, so they're above the recommended GPU, and as expected, it's unplayable at 1080p with epic details. Maximum, which is the maximum preset, just like other recent games by the lack of VRAM. So again, saying that the maximum settings, even at 1080p, use too much VRAM for the 8GB 3070. We tried lowering the preset to high or even medium, but some areas still have this problem. So even going down to medium settings at 1080p was still seeing VRAM spillover if this author has correctly identified what's going wrong. Again, it looks like there's a lot of CPU limitations, but they seem pretty confident they're talking about VRAM spillover here. So anyway, they also tested on a laptop with a Core i7-7700HQ, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and a GTX 1070 mobile, and it's playable at 30 FPS in 1080p with lower medium settings, depending on the area, but it's far from stable. Now, this author also mentions the poor CPU optimization, showing bottleneck that varies from region to region, but undoubtedly highlights the lack of optimization in general. There were parts where the GPU runs at 99%, but others more like 60 to 70%. And again, that's a lot of like what I'm seeing here in this video, where the GPU is at 44% usage in this scene. So the 5900X is just unable to supply it. And the 4090 is not running out of VRAM, right? The game's trying to use 18 gigabytes, and the 4090 has 24, and that's at 1440p, need I say again. So that's pretty brutal. Now, it's also been suggested that the game is better optimized for AMD. I've seen a lot of comments on Reddit linking to tweets like these, where somebody's comparing their 4090 running a scene at 46 FPS, and then looking at a similar shot with, let me zoom out here, with a 7900 XTX from AMD, which is usually a weaker GPU, running the same area at 58 FPS. Now, the one thing I will mention, though, is, again, if the game is CPU limited, then the reason why the AMD GPU would be running faster here is that AMD gets CPU limited at a higher frame rate. NVIDIA gets CPU limited at a lower frame rate because the NVIDIA drivers use more CPU overhead, so basically it becomes CPU bottlenecked earlier at a lower frame rate on NVIDIA GPUs. So while, sure, the game is AMD sponsored, I believe. I mean, it's bundled with their CPUs at least, and only has FSR, so I think it's an AMD sponsored game. That doesn't necessarily mean that this is for sure showing better optimization on AMD, other than the fact that when you are CPU limited, AMD GPUs will outperform because they're just not using the CPU as much for their driver overhead. Again, this is definitely a CPU limited screenshot because the GPU utilization is at 83%. So the GPU is not fully utilized here. And if we scroll back to the NVIDIA screenshot, the GPU utilization is only at 36%. So what that tells me is if the 4090 could be fully utilized in this scene up to 100%, then it actually would be outperforming what the 7900 XTX could do in this scene if it was being fully utilized. But neither of them are being fully utilized, so all this is showing is the well-known, at least to the enthusiast community, like it's been established on channels like Hardware Unboxed, and I've pointed out in my reviews as well, that when AMD is CPU limited, their GPUs are at a higher frame rate when that happens due to differences in overhead. Now, as this author has pointed out, the recommended GPU for this game is an RTX 2070 alongside an AMD RX 6700 XT, which has 12 gigabytes, although the 2070 is an 8 gigabyte GPU. They list that as an NVIDIA alternative. This is on EA's website. Now, this isn't one of the greatest system requirements lists I've ever seen. It just has the minimum and recommended. They don't give you any frame rate target or even resolution target for any of this, so I don't think this is particularly useful, other than them saying the CPUs should be at least 4-core, 8-thread, and that is consistent with the game does seem to heavily utilize 4 cores and then some others in the shots I was able to see here. And we've got the RX 580 as the minimum recommended GPU, also listing the GTX 1070 as an NVIDIA alternative. If I pull this up on Tech PowerUp GPU database, the RX 580 is an 8 gigabyte GPU. If we look at its normal relative performance, it would be weaker than a 1070. The 1070 would usually be significantly faster. The RX 580 would normally pair with the GTX 1060. So once again, are we seeing AMD optimization? I actually think it's VRAM. Remember, we were seeing complaints that the 3070 with 8 gigabytes of VRAM was still struggling at 1080p at medium settings, right? So the GTX 1060, which would be a more direct comparison to the RX 580 in terms of power of the GPU itself, is only a 6 gigabyte GPU, whereas the 1070, I believe, is an 8 gigabyte GPU. Let me double check. Yes, it's an 8 gigabyte GPU. By the way, that means that the 70 class GPUs from NVIDIA have been at 8 gigabytes for 1070, 2070, and 3070. People were, I think, justified in complaining about that. But anyway, and we're seeing it bite right here. I think that's what's going on with that, why the 1070 is paired with the RX 580 in the recommendations. And they specifically say you want a DX12 GPU with at least 8 gigabytes VRAM minimum. That's the minimum specs. The recommended specs are an RX 6700 XT, which is a 12 gigabyte GPU. And again, they're saying that you do want at least 8 gigabytes of VRAM. By the way, it's 155 gigabyte install and recommended for an SSD. And then they list the RTX 2070, like we said, as the NVIDIA comparison there. If we jump up then, kind of look in our charts, that is jumping up a bit in performance for the recommendations, but they don't tell us what sorts of resolution and settings and all that you should be getting for this. The 2070 is generally weaker than a 6700 XT, which was the AMD recommendation here. So honestly, that feels a little bit weird anyway, but since they're not giving us any actual resolution or frame rate targets, I don't know, man. What do you guys think about all this? Like I said, I'll link all these sources in the description. You can watch this extended gameplay of the 4090 on this 5900X at 1440p with the massive VRAM. And, in some scenes here, they're up at 96 FPS and the GPU is 80% utilized. So it's not like the GPU can't get there. It's just that usually its utilization is below 50% on a 5900X. Like I said, I plan on covering some testing of this game when it actually launches and I get my hands on it. What do you guys think in the comment section? I would certainly be careful. Like, I'm pre-ordering it because I'm going to test it out on the channel. I think you guys might want to hang out and see if the day one patches and people like me who test it out see how it actually ends up running on a variety of hardware. Like I said, I would specifically be looking at CPU limitations in this game. And then there's the VRAM issue. Those seem to be the two big things. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.